Hola, bona nit a tots. Buenas noches.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for being here. This is the fourth conference of the cycle Photography Speaks of Revolution, directed by Laura Terré for the KBR Fundación Mapfre, which we've been engaged in since the beginning of October. It's a pleasure to have Robert Pledge here. And I just want to welcome the people that are online with us, and you can send in your questions using the chat, and Laura Terré, after the lecture, will pass those questions on to the speaker. So that's all. Thank you very much. And without further ado, we will proceed. Good afternoon, evening. Welcome to this series of Photography Speaks of Revolutions. In this case, we are going to talk about the Cultural Revolution, also known as the Big Proletariat Revolution, the social and political movement that took place in China between 1966 and 1976. I'm not going to say anything about this because we have Robert Pledge here to do that, and we thank him for the effort for having come to Barcelona to do this session, this in-person session, which makes things so different and allows us to communicate emotion better. Thank you, Robert. Robert Pledge is known by many of you who are interested in photography, is considered to be one of the most prestigious photo editors in the world. He studied anthropology, also African languages, and he found his way towards photojournalism as a specialist in African affairs. In 1976, he was co-founder of Contact Press, the prestigious Contact Press Images, the prestigious photography agency devoted to international projects, long-term projects. He has been curator and producer of important books that are manuals, true manuals today of, and also exhibitions. And Pledge today is developing a project called 9/11, Chile, 1973. And he is here with us today to talk about Li Zhensheng, the Chinese photographer. He was editor of the prestigious book Red Color News Soldier, which is also published in Spain under the title Soldado Rojo de las Noticias in 2003 by Faden Press. And the La Caixa Foundation did an exhibition on that toured in Spain and also was seen in many different countries, most European countries and American countries. And this book presented for the first time photographs of the Chinese Cultural Revolution that had been hidden to modern historians in China and the rest of the world. And I will leave you with Robert, who will give us a talk in English. And I remind you that you have the possibility of following it, following the simultaneous interpreting online and also here in the room. So when you're ready, Robert. Thank you.
No habla castellano. Yo entiendo un poco, and I'm not going to speak in Chinese. I think because I don't speak the language, which actually is something important to say for everybody to understand, is that I worked on a project on the Cultural Revolution in China with an extraordinary person who also is a phenomenal photographer, Li Zhensheng, and he doesn't speak a word of English. He never spoke a word of English, and I could not speak any Chinese. So it took us a long time to do this book, 3.5 years, because of translation back and forth and all the complexities. And actually, I'm very happy to be here in Barcelona because you are here and it's good to speak to people about the legacy of such an important photographer, artist, and individual as Li Zhensheng. I'm sad also because really he should be the one here speaking to you. But unfortunately, he died last year. And I really wanted to be here in person as more as a tribute to him, because he came to Barcelona for the big exhibition at La Caixa Forum, and when the book was published in Spain, and he traveled to a couple of venues where the work was presented, and he loved Barcelona. He came here twice, and I know he would have enjoyed very much being here instead of me. So that's why I'm pleased to be here, even though he is no longer with us. And yes, let me speak to you about this project, because, you know, speaking of revolution, it's such an interesting topic. And since the Commune in Paris, I think there has been photography on many major revolutionary events. But there's something quite unique about this one, which is that it's a revolution that almost never ended. It lasted 10 years. And it was really a revolution within a revolution, because since the establishment of China on October 1st, 1949, the country was always undergoing some transformation. There was a revolutionary process that followed the occupation or partial occupation of China by Japan before World War II, and then the civil war between the communists led by Chairman Mao Zedong, and the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek, the general who ended up going to Taiwan and setting up a different entity. So it's been the longest of all revolutions that I know of, and there is no other revolution that has been seen and explained by a single individual who was a photographer. That is what is so extraordinary about it. On other important revolutions, there is work, there is photography, otherwise there wouldn't be a series of lectures here. But most often, several photographers have to bring their work together to give us a sense of what that event was. With the Cultural Revolution, there were other photographers here and there. Most of them were propaganda photographers, because you could not be a photographer going around taking pictures if you were not an official photographer. And those photographers usually took what is known as propaganda photography, which is, from a historical point of view, very important and very interesting. But Li Zhensheng, the man you see on the screen here, shot maybe 10 years ago, and the way he looked when he passed away, was a bit of a propaganda photographer, a very independent-minded photographer who had history in his mind, and realizing that the event was so important. He was a participant, he was an actor, he was a victim of the situation, he was everything. It is absolutely unique in the history of the medium that somebody ever was in that position. And that is why his work is so important, not only in terms of Chinese history, but to understand the process, a revolutionary process, the different phases and steps and changes and moods and shifts and conflicts and confrontations of all kinds that take place in these situations. I'm not an expert on revolutions, although I was a young student in Paris during the May events of 1968. that was called a revolution. So of course the question is, what is a revolution? And maybe that is something you'll want to answer at the end after all the lectures. And I've done several books that were related to revolution with photographers, like what happened in Iran in 1979 with the overthrow of the Shah of Iran, and then all the events that came and brought Ayatollah Khomeini and a complete change of society. A young American photographer was there, the only American photographer, David Burnett, and he was there for 44 days, and he tells us what happened. It's quite extraordinary. I was in Chile in 1971 and that period of time when Chile was undergoing tremendous changes. So I have a sense of what a revolution is, in a very physical term. But this one is something for me that is extraordinary. So here's the man, this man who was such an extraordinary person. I mean, the energy, the intelligence. And here he is when he was a young photographer in his office at the Heilongjiang daily newspaper, where he found a job. He did not want to be a photographer. He wanted to be a filmmaker. And he went to a film school in Changchun in the province of Jilin in China during the period of the Great Leap Forward, which was a very difficult period for China that led to tremendous disasters, a famine that might have cost the life of 30 or more million people. But he was told at one point there was no room for filmmakers, that he had to become a photojournalist. And his school closed down and restarted as a school of photojournalism. So he became a photographer. And he found a job in a newspaper. He refused all the jobs that were officially offered to him. He didn't like them. So he went to this northern city that is very cold and very Siberian. Heilongjiang province is sitting right next to Siberia, Russia today, the Soviet Union then, and he joined a small team of photographers for a daily newspaper. A daily newspaper was so important everywhere in the world, but in China particularly, because newspapers were the tool that the party, the Communist Party, that the state was using as a propaganda tool, but just as a means of communication information, because the internet did not exist then. Television was not present in China. Radio was to some extent, and most of the people were illiterate, so very few people actually read. There were enough to read the newspaper that had a circulation of nearly 300,000 copies, which was a lot then, but people could read pictures, even if they could read characters and words. So newspapers were very, very important in China, and he ended up joining one of the very important newspapers in China, because Heilongjiang province played a very important role in the modern history of China. The capital is Harbin, and the province is sitting between the former Soviet Union and the main part of China. It's the most northern province. It was very much a Russian city too, and during the Cultural Revolution, the Orthodox churches that were often made of wood, very beautiful, were torn down by the Red Guards. The Red Guards, actually, the what do you call it? The armband, that Li Zhensheng is wearing here in this picture, that reads Red Collar News Soldier. Even I can read it. I can tell you it says Red Collar News Soldier. It's because I know it. And it is an armband that he made to be able to cover the events, because as a young journalist, when the events took place, very quickly, the Red Guards and the revolutionary people were very, very cautious towards the media, the official media, because it belonged to the Communist Party. And here the rebels, the revolutionists, wanted to break the system. But with this armband, it allowed him to move around. So let's get into the revolution. Let's start looking at pictures. That's sort of a general introduction. I know it's not always easy. I will try not to use words or expressions that are too complicated from that period of time. So this is the armband, red color, new soldier, Red Guard. That's really what it means, Red Guard. And this is actually the armband that he would receive much later on when he formed a rebel team at his newspaper that was fighting against other teams, because everybody in China at that time was proclaiming that they were more authentically revolutionary than everybody else, that they were the true believers and they were the true followers of Mao, and all the others were revisionists, were traitors, were black elements, etc. And everybody was accusing the others of the worst possible things, which is why, and that's not unusual totally in revolutionary environments. It happened during the French Revolution. It happened even in Chile, and in the 70s. It happens in every because they're hardliners, the softer ones, and okay. But it was very brutal in China, and Li Zhensheng, who's not a violent man by any means, is a survivor, and he understood that he needed to survive to use, like everybody else, some of the tricks, but more importantly, as a photographer, to be able to witness and record what was going on, he had to be clever, and he was smarter than most of the people. I met him in 1987, I believe, or 88 in China. At one event, I was presenting a big exhibition in 88, at the end of 88, on Tiananmen Square in a museum. It was the first major exhibition of photography. I took 3 different exhibitions and put them together. There were 580 pieces. It was huge. And we had 10,000 visitors a day during the week and 15,000 a day on the weekends. You know, this is China. The numbers are staggering. And there was an eagerness, an interest in the outside world, because we were only 10 years after Deng Xiaoping, who had become the paramount leader in China after the death of Mao Zedong and the elimination of the Gang of Four with Mrs. Mao as one of the leaders. And China was opening up. So it was 10 years after the proclamation of the open up policies under Deng Xiaoping, 1988, a new generation was coming in. People were curious, they were eager, they wanted to know what the world was about. And I met Li on that occasion, one event that was organized for us to meet the Chinese photographers. And he told me through a translator, who ended up becoming a translator at the United Nations later on, and became one of the translators on this book. It's a very small world, it's quite extraordinary. But he, through this translator, asked me if I would help him to do a book. He wanted to do a book with his best pictures. And I said, sure, I would consider. I hear a lot of people ask me that question. And I said, what is the book about? And he told me the story of these pictures that he had hidden under the floorboard of his one-room apartment where he lived with his wife and 2 children during the Cultural Revolution, and he hid what he called his negative negatives, those negatives that were not politically correct. So they were negative films that had a negative content in terms of the official political language of the day. And he hid them and he preserved that work, and there was nothing alike. And for the first time in my life, I said to somebody, yes, I do the exhibition and work on a book with you, even though I had not seen one single picture by this photographer. Well, 6 months later, Tiananmen Square happened, the events in the spring, and that suspended our project. So we waited patiently 10 years until 1999 to get together. He came to the United States and we spoke about it. And I said, I want to see all the work. He said, all the work. I have 100,000 images, negatives. I said, I want to see everything. He said, I can't. I mean, it's all in Beijing. I said, well, and he said, everything is not about the Cultural Revolution. Only 60,000. I said, well, 60,000 is enough. But it would be better if you already edited it down to maybe 30,000. And I would be happy to look at 30,000 images, which I ended up doing and producing a 300 image book. So we went from 30,000 to 300, and in the exhibition, 150 images. That's the process of editing materials. But what was extraordinary, he went back and forth between the United States and China. He had become a green card holder in the meantime. And he brought back these envelopes, like the one on the screen, made of craft. He made the envelopes himself. And inside the envelope was a negative or strip of negative. And on the envelope was a contact image that he had cut out from a contact sheet, from his negatives contact sheet, and he had pasted on, and then he wrote captions that you can see, characters up there, and what is printed in red is the name of his newspaper, Heilongjiang Daily. This image tells us a little bit everything. I like to take one image and to stay for hours on one image and tell a whole story that might like to, but I'm not going to do that to you because you came to see a few more. So we're going to move a little faster from now on. And if I move too fast, you stop me. You ask Laura,
Yes.
to ask me to shut up and slow down, which I'm happy to do. So yes, this is another image. Now you've noticed the two little bags I'm showing you, they have these long panoramic images. In effect, and this is also what is extraordinary with Li Zhensheng, is that he, and that's when you realize he was really a filmmaker in his mind. He had the sort of panoramic vision of situations. As I told you, he worked in Harbin. He was born in Dalian, which is a neighboring province, and he studied in Jilin, which is another neighboring province. Heilongjiang, Liaoning province, where Dalian is, and Jilin province form the northeast of China, if you will. They're very much connected, and that's where he comes from. And they are all neighboring the former Soviet Union, where therefore the cultural influence at that time, after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, that led to what happened in China later on. As you probably know, Mao Zedong was one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 in Shanghai. There were only 23 or 4 of them. Then the Russian, the Soviet influence was tremendous. And of course, culturally speaking, it was also the only language that Li learned, foreign language he ever learned, was Russian, that he forgot very quickly. But he was very much influenced by that strong tradition, visual tradition of the Soviet Union from Eisenstein on in film, because filmmaking was with these, because Heilongjiang, once again, is very much, geographically speaking, in terms of landscape, like Siberia, these very long travelings, Eisenstein, these endless dynamic movement of masses through space, etc. And you notice that it's quite the opposite of the French New Wave, for instance, which is very intimate and everything is between the four walls of a bedroom or something like this. This is the opposite. This is the Eisenstein tradition, and these things. But he didn't have a panoramic camera. So he made his panoramas with his still images, taking several images, one after the other, and then stitching them together. And here you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, I think there are 4 different images. In the previous one, there were, I think, 5 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think 5 or 6. And but most of his images are single images like this one. And that's an image of Heilongjiang. You can see it's cold in the winter, and the winter lasts forever. The trees become ice sculptures. He would work, like many photographers at that time, in 2 formats: a square format, 2¼ 6 by 6, and 35 millimeter format. So he had a Leica and a Rolleiflex. Now, Leica and a Rolleiflex are expensive cameras. They are the best cameras, but they were very expensive. In China, they were more than expensive. They were an absolute luxury. But every photographer in every newspaper in China had a Leica and a Rolleiflex, which tells you how important newspapers were for the state, for the party, for the Communist Party. They gave them the best material so they could do the best possible work, which is a detail that speaks very loudly. And these images are not yet the Cultural Revolution. When Li Zhensheng started as a young photographer, very quickly, he was sent out to the countryside, like many young people, to participate in the socialist educational movement, to live with the peasants, to learn from them the wisdom of the masses, and to maybe make some contribution, not only to work with the peasants and to help with the farming and everything else, but to help them also to maybe read or something like this. Actually, so he very early on found himself, and that is him at that time. That's his style, and you can see his camera, you can see it's a Leica, you can see he has a flash. The flash is actually more for his 2¼ camera. He is well equipped, and you notice that he has a certain elegance to him. He has a hat, he has a thing, he doesn't look like a peasant, even though he comes from a very poor background. His mother died when he was 3 years old. He was raised by his grandparents. He was born in Dalian, but he was sent to his grandparents to their native Shandong province, which is neighboring in a small place called Wancheng. And And that's where he grew up with his sister. His father was a cook on a steamship, a cargo ship. He didn't see him much for the first 10 years of his life. And he was born in 1940. So you had to remember, 1940, Japan had occupied the whole northeastern, from Shanghai on, up north of China. It was under Japanese occupation. So he grew up in this sort of wartime environment and losing a mother very early, being born by a grandmother. Finally, at the age of 10, his father came back and took him back to Dalian. And that's when he went to school for the first time in his life, when he was 10 years old. He was obviously very smart. He very quickly went up the echelons and ended up in high school, and then applied to go to the film school in Changchun, Jilin, and he was accepted at the age of 17 or 18, which is absolutely remarkable already. And he had a passion for movies. When he was back in Dalian, his father was then living there because he had lost the job on the steamboat. The war had disrupted everything. And but his father would take him once a week to see a movie. Most of the movies were Soviet movies or Czech movies or Polish movies, occasionally a French and Italian, and more occasionally an American one. And he loved movies. He couldn't afford to go there himself, so often he would sit in front of the movie house. The loudspeaker there would a loudspeaker that would give you the sound of the film, and he would imagine the film just listening to the words, and then speaking to some of his friends who were inside about the film itself to see if what he had imagined based on the words corresponded to what they saw on the screen. So you realize that there's a sort of amazing agility in the brain and in the eye in this kid at this age. And it is not surprising in the end that he did what he did in that regard. Well, so this is still the socialist education movement. I mean, you can sense that this is leading to something. The peasants get together, they're leaders who criticize other people. The other people are landlords who are often as poor as the other peasants, but they own a little bit of land and they have people work for them, and they publicly are denounced and publicly humiliated, like here. They work at, they're sent to hard labor in the field. And you realize that this young photographer knows how to compose, and he has a sense of visual drama, if you will. I mean, the skies, the silhouette, the thing. There's something that, of course, his interest in film and in visual things, because he's a very good calligrapher. He was a very good calligrapher, and he was also a drawer and painter. He drew a lot of flowers and landscapes, etc. And actually, he sold some of his paintings to wallpaper companies and calendar companies, and made a little bit of money so he could go and see a film. And that's how he ended up buying a camera one day. And he did these that I mentioned, panoramics or composite panoramics. And here's a good example. It's a diptych, only 2 images. Here's one, here's the other. They're a little bit cut off on both sides. And then he would bring them together. Then he would overlap them. And then he would stitch them and cut them so it would become one image. This is the performance, the ballet performing a very sort of revolutionary dance. The image is very dramatic. It's done on stage. He probably did it for the newspaper. And as you notice, the images are never cropped. They are what the camera recorded what his eyes saw. There's no fabrication, no manipulation, except for the overlapping when he does these panoramics. And in another situation that I will show you as we go along. This gives us a sense of what is going to happen sometime soon. And on May 16th of 1966, about a month after he came back from the his 2 years, he was supposed to have done 1 year as part of the socialist educational movement, but because they felt he was a rebel and too independent, they forced him to stay another year there, and which he did. And then he came back to the newspaper just as Mao Zedong and the Communist Party proclaimed the start of the great proletarian cultural revolution. What we know as a cultural revolution that we say lasted 10 years, from 1966 to 1976. The official ending of the Cultural Revolution is actually a little earlier. It's probably in 1969. Others say it's at the death of Lin Biao, who was the man behind it with the Gang of Four, who died in a plane crash in Mongolia in 1971, maybe assassinated by Mao, and the plane was sabotaged. We don't quite know because he was going to succeed to Mao. It's still a bit of a mystery, but in reality, it really lasted 10 years until the chairman passed away in September of 1976. So it's a little more than 10 years. And this was when it was proclaimed right at the beginning. Li is there at the beginning. He's there before and he senses what is going to happen, and he's there at the start. And there's a lot of excitement. People on the street, they're carrying these paintings, these portraits of Mao. They put them in frames that you use in a very bourgeois salon in a house with and they put these pictures of Mao. That's at the beginning. It will change as we go. And Li himself feels that he's going to be part of something very important because Mao himself said that every 7 or 8 years, there will be a revolution, a cultural revolution taking place in China to make sure that China stays on the right line and etc. So Li said, wow, this is great. My career is made. Every 7 or 8 years, I'm going to attend some great event and I'm going to be able to witness that. And here he is acting as these opera heroes and movie heroes, facing the enemy with no fear, offing his chest and ready to fight for the good cause. Actually, this is very interesting because this image created a little bit of anxiety with Li Zhensheng's family when I put it in the selection of images. And Xiaobing, who I believe might be listening to us as we're speaking, I had sent her the information. Xiaobing is the daughter of Li Zhensheng, and Zhou Yingsha, Li Zhensheng's wife, her mother, and Xiaohan is the son. Xiaobing was one of the translators who worked with us. She graduated in journalism from the University of Hong Kong, and at first she didn't want to be part of it, but she was so essential to making this book, because I would mention the other translator who was a United Nations person today and a very good friend. He was a translator and he didn't want, in the tradition of the United Nations, he was not interpreting, he was translating. And we wanted sometimes more than that. We wanted to understand the nuances, and we We had to ask the question to Li several times about what happened and why and how, etc. And with the translation, it was complicated. And very often, Xiaobing, who spoke English fluently and Chinese, and was deeply trusted by her father, or even though she was a girl, you know, that makes a big difference. She was so essential. So she says to me, my mother is going to feel very uncomfortable if you show my father's chest in your book. And then gives a lot of explanation why it should not be there. And I said, you know, each time you explain why it should not be there, you only reinforce the idea in my mind that it must be published. And actually was published because Li Zhensheng's wife, Shu Yingsha, said it was, with her, it was fine, no problem. That's a very important image. And it's important because we realize that this man, this photographer, this witness to history, this participant, actor, victim of this humongous event that would transform China, and the effects are still felt today. You can't understand China today if you don't know what happened during those 10 years. It is so essential because it's almost the reverse of the coin, if you will. Li Zhensheng photographed himself almost every day during that period of the Cultural Revolution. He's one of these very rare photographers who did self-portraits for an extended period of time. It's not many people have done self-portrait, take pictures of themselves, and very few have done it so consistently at a period of time that was so historically meaningful, so charged with so much stuff that they take on a different significance. When he was a student at the film, to save money, to be able to buy film, he used himself as the subject of the portrait assignments that he was given. When he had to use other people, he had to pay a little bit of money. Not having to pay them by using himself as the subject made it easier for him to buy some extra film. And there's something so introspective. There's something so interesting in terms of himself questioning his identity and trying to position himself within the framework of these events. And all along, and there are a few pictures in the book, we were working on another book that would be only his self-portraits before he died. I won't do that book if I don't die before I can finish it, of course. We were roughly the same age. He was only a year and a half older than I was. So you never know. But that's one of my last projects, is to do this book of portraits, self-portraits by Li Zhensheng, that are another way, not only of speaking about himself, but of speaking about these events that took place and reshaped him and the rest of China, but also the image of China itself in the world and the perception that so many people have of that country. Very important image, square format. Many of his self-portraits are in a square format. He would set it up on a camera like there, and then with a self-timer, he would position himself into and take the pauses or whatever. Sometimes there were group shots. He did that a lot. And these are the early days of the Cultural Revolution, when people are on the streets and giving support to Chairman Mao, etc. And this is an image that could have been published in the newspaper. There are crowds, there are banners, they're the kind of images that photographers in newspapers take and are published in the newspaper in Spain, in America, anywhere in the world. But in China, this at that time, no, impossible. Why? Because they're portraits of Mao and they're fists up in the air, and they give the impression that they're punching his face or uppercutting him, hitting his chin. Not possible. The words written on the banner, the instructions of Mao Zedong, of the chairman, are partially hidden by the hands and the flags in the foreground. No, you cannot edit the words of the chairman. Not possible. And the image there with the black frame, it's a black and white picture. So the red frame of the revolution, the frame becomes black in the image. Impossible. Not possible. Not possible. You've got to do something about it, Comrade Li Zhensheng. Retouch the image. And that's when he did manipulate his images. And with great skill, because he was a painter, he was a calligrapher, and he had the intelligence needed to do it. And all of a sudden, his rectangular image becomes almost a square image, is cut off from the left, the hands hiding the portrait. The hands that were hitting him in the chin had disappeared. Oh, they're no there. They've been retouched. Amazing. And the red frame that was black is no longer there. It's white. It's beautiful. And the hands and the flags that were hiding the words, the characters of Mao Zedong's quote, well, they disappeared. And the characters are there. The calligrapher, Li Zhensheng, redid them. He did everything. Li Zhensheng would not allow anybody to touch his negatives. He was very much in the tradition of magnum photographers or contact photographers. The photographers protect their work. The negatives are theirs. Nobody touches them without their permission. So he was the only photographer among the 5 at the newspaper who would process his own film, who would edit his own film, who would choose the images carefully, who would print them. And if they were not politically correct, if they were negative, he would turn them into positive so that they could get published at the request of the editor. This is also something quite phenomenal and quite unique in history where somebody finds himself in this sort of situation. This is the front page of his newspaper. So it's a big newspaper, Halong Daily at the top, always the chairman on the front page in one way or the other. A smaller picture of Chairman Mao with Lin Biao, who was his number 2, and the man who invented the Little Red Book in the early 60s. The Little Red Book was a book of instructions by the chairman, intended primarily for the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. The PLA became the People's Liberation Army after the Red Army beat the Japanese and beat Chiang Kai-shek. So the People's Liberation Army leader was Lin Biao. But the Little Red Book became the Little Red Book of everybody. And after the Bible, is probably the most published ever book in the history of mankind, much more than Harry Potter's books, even. So anyhow, and in all languages, that's the way the paper looked. And of course, to be on the front of on the front page of the paper was always something important. But now the Cultural Revolution is really underway. I mean, here, people on the street, they're performing the dance of this one, the right to rebel. Mao said you had to rebel against the status quo, against even the leaders of the Communist Party who were in power. they had to be overthrown, and you had to bombard the headquarters and get rid of them. And this was there was a famous song that Li actually would perform. He knew all the songs. And when we were editing the book, he would sing the songs and he would dance the dances, which for us was so important to understand the pictures and what was happening then and how people would gather around these situations and come together. You never quite understood if people were always in support or they were there so that their neighbors and friends could see that they were there and would not be, therefore they would not be accused of being counter-revolutionaries or black elements or people who were going to do bad things. But very quickly things became more brutal, more violent. Public officials, I think this is Wang Yilun, who was a party secretary, one of the party secretaries who is denounced for multiple reasons and is forced to stand on a table, to bow his head, to wear a placard around his neck with his name and with his crimes listed there. I mean, in psychological terms, emotional terms, this is devastating. That is why the number, that and many other things, of suicides in China was so tremendous during that period of time, estimated at more than 3 million people who committed suicide, such as, for instance, the mother of Li Zhensheng's wife, who was accused of being a landlord, of doing this and that, etc. And she, it's the mother of the father, committed suicide. The mother or the father, I'm mixing the two, of Li Zhensheng's first girlfriend also committed suicide. And these are people who were very close to him. But this was common. The number of people who did that was tremendous. This is one of the scenes. And of course, there were fierce attacks against religion, the temples, the Buddhist temples. And that's when Li Zhensheng started to say, but is this really a cultural revolution? If it is a revolution that destructs culture on such a massive basis, and then he started having doubts. And this is one of his famous panoramics, where there are 3 images that he builds together, then he overlaps, and I'm going too fast. I thought we'd see the whole image, and he will stitch it together, overlap the pictures so it looks like one single image. And he's very far away, and you can see that in the background over there at the end near the temple, there's something going on. These people are chanting down with the Buddhist monks and all this kind of stuff. And Li walks up close because zoom did not exist then. The zoom was the legs of the photographer. That was the zoom. If you wanted to be up close, as Robert Capa would say, it's not good enough because you're not close enough, you would have to walk up close. And Li, filmmaker, aspiring filmmaker, had an understanding of this, of the movement, the distance, getting close, moving back, moving in, looking in a panoramic way, peripheral vision. All these things are so important that many of the photographers, his colleagues, absolutely didn't understand. And that is why, even just from a purely photographic point of view, his work is so different, is so special compared to anything else from that period of time. Not only in China, I mean, there are not many people even in the rest of the world. Cartier-Bresson only worked with a 35mm camera, and only with one lens for the most part. 50mm lens, occasionally a couple of others. And other photographers, many newspaper photographers worked with the square format, because, and with speed graphics, which were a big format and one flash, one image, boom, one image, front page or not of newspaper. It was this, single images, the decisive moment, that instant, whereas filmmakers think differently. They think in movement. The head might be still, but the eyes move sideways, up and down. They get in close. And that's how Li Zhensheng operated. So he comes in close in that situation. And here are these monks holding these signs that read something like, the monks are all dog farts. Now that's a pretty heavy kind of thing, and they have to also be publicly humiliated. And I told you that the wooden churches, Orthodox churches, Russian churches were torn down and burnt down, but the Buddhist temples were. So it was a little bit all religions. And it's true that Mao had a particular distaste for religion. I'm not a religious person at all. I would be more like Mao, an atheist, if you will, but I would be at least respectful of the places of worship, and worship. Sorry, I'm kidding. I'm going to drink a bit of water in a second, and particularly if it's charged with history, these sculptures, etc. But here they're totally desecrated. There's something terrible, and it's not only outside; it's in his own newspaper. Editors, people in charge, administrators in the newspapers are called in and are individually denounced as being this or being that, and they're publicly humiliated, and they have to wear these dunce hats on which is written the bad things they did, and these sessions go on and on and on. In front of all the portraits from Mao to Sun Yat-sen, I guess, all the way at the end, those people who shaped modern China. And this is terrible. And Li started feeling that, well, maybe he was hoping there would not be every 7 or 8 years one of these things, even if it meant that his career would not be as successful as he was hoping it might be. And he saw scenes like this where the first party secretary of the province, who was also the secretary of the party for Harbin, a very venerable and reputable man, was brought up, forced to stand up on a folding chair that therefore, if you moved one side or the other, could tip over, and they would pour black ink to turn his face into black and make him like the devil. And they poured ink in his shirt and attached his hand behind his back, and they attached it with a string to his hat and to his neck, so that if he moved, it would force a chair to wobble and he could fall off, etc. It was a terrifying experience for people like this in a stadium filled with maybe 100,000 self-proclaimed Red Guards. Can you imagine that? Here we're in a room where already, if there was anger on this side of the table, we on this side would be in fear. But imagine if there were 100,000 out there and surrounding you, and you had your hands tied and you couldn't move and you were on a chair. So that people would commit suicide after several sessions like that is not entirely unreasonable, I would say. especially scholars, intellectuals, people like that, who would be even more sensitive to these kinds of, and wouldn't understand the absurdity of it. And at the same time, the newspaper showed a picture not by Li Zhensheng, from Xinhua, showing the chairman thinking about the problems and the issues of the country, domestically and internationally, day and night, nonstop. Well, we know that Mao did sleep a lot. He was old already, etc. But that was part of the propaganda. That was part of the whole landscape, if you will. And other dignitaries, political leaders from the party were brought up and treated this way. I'm not sure from here who this is anymore. I probably have the name written down if you really want to know, but I'm sure you don't, because you will forget. That's Chen Lei, who was one of the party secretaries, who is being mistreated. If you read Chinese, you can read the names there, so I let you figure it out. And the crimes. This is the wife of the governor of the province of Heilongjiang, Li Xia, also being criticized and brought to the stadium there where these Red Guards would gather. And here is Li Fanwu, the governor himself, who happens, unfortunately for him, to be built a bit the way the chairman was and have a bit the same style. And he is brought there and denounced as being a very ambitious politician in the party who was trying to take over power from Mao Zedong by trying to look like him. And so they decided, well, they had to do something about it. And these 14 and 15-year-old kids, self-proclaimed Red Guards, came and decided to cut the hair of Governor Li Fanwu. And of course, their equipment, they're not professional hairdressers on the one hand, and their equipment was probably a little rusty, so they did a lot of damage. And they tore off the hair, they cut it, they put it down his neck, and after quite a while, well, he had a new haircut. He could have joined the Marines, I guess, but no, it was not evenly cut. It's very brutal. And Li Zhensheng is very clever here. You see that he finds an angle and he is able to bring in the portrait of Mao that's hanging in the background, and he chose that position. He chose that position. Now, this is where it becomes very important. The photographer in this kind of situation, what does he do? You know, do you take the pictures or not? It's a debate in the profession that goes on endlessly. In Bangladesh, when there was these soldiers who were piercing people that they consider as traitors with the bayonet, some photographers like Mapfre decided that he was not going to attend because he thought that the presence of the photographers was going to provoke this kind of situation. And others said, no, it's going to happen whether you're there or not. So if it's going to happen, be discreet, but be there and witness it so that there is a trace of this. Well, Li did not know Mapfre or any of the other photographers. He used his own judgment. He realized that when these big events that started off with chanting, with slogans, with all that kind of stuff, his 4 colleagues, photographers who were there photographing also, they were there, it was fine. But as soon as it was starting to become ugly and tense and violent, they would disappear. And their excuse is that we had to go back to the newspaper to process our film to get it published in the newspaper. Now, Li wanted to be published as much as the others, but he realized that if he wasn't there, there would be no trace of any of this. And his master in photography was Wu Yingxiang, who had been a photographer on the Long March with Mao, the very reputable, distinguished, nicknamed the Cartier-Bresson of China, a really phenomenal photographer. I had the pleasure, honor to meet, who said the photographer should not only be the witness to what is happening, but he must record what is happening for history. He is a historian. He's not only in the moment, he is there for the future. And that has been the driving force behind everything that Li Zhensheng did, and why he used all the tools he could to finesse his way into the situation without putting himself in such a situation that he could be threatened, etc., using the armband, speaking to people. He was a very articulate, even not highly educated, and a great communicator and a charmer. He could speak himself. He was the perfect photographer in that sense. And he attended those events when the other photographers were gone. And those became his negatives, because he knew that these pictures would never be published in a newspaper. But he still took the time, spent the energy, took the risk, and shot them. That is something major. That is something so important, because I think in China, he is the only one, or one of very few, who did that. I know another photographer, Chinese photographer, who was in the army, was an army photographer, PLA. He was in Tibet, and he was so offended by what he saw happening to the Tibetans and during the Cultural Revolution. He took pictures. He was an amateur photographer, and he kept his pictures. And his daughter, because he died fairly young, got in touch with me after we published the book and wanted to show me the work that I saw, and it's quite amazing. And it is absolutely parallel to Li Zhensheng's. It's not as good, it's not as complete, it's not as thorough. He was an army guy, so he didn't have the position of a journalist that Li had, but you realize that everything was happening everywhere in China at the same time. Why? Because of newspapers. Newspapers were the internet of that time, more than the radio. Even the radio played a role, but the newspapers, because that's where things were said. Meetings tomorrow, gatherings here, support of, blah, 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 and people came. The newspapers were so important. So Li Zhensheng was in a very privileged situation from that point of view, but his privilege was to be smart and to understand that he had a responsibility. That's the way he felt about it. And he took upon himself to do that. At this event, to denounce this governor, who would be publicly humiliated over 2,000 times, 2,000 times, sessions that would last anywhere from 3 to 6 hours. Do the calculations yourself. I'm not going to do it for you. And you realize, and he was mistreated. Red Guards would put needles in him, pinch. He even kept, and Li went many years later to photograph him and the under the long johns and the underwear he was wearing that has all these marks of these needles and these blood stains on the needle. The governor's wife, who we saw, the one with the black face earlier, kept it, put it aside because they wanted traces of it. And here he is in the middle, that's Li Fanwu, and then Chen Lei and Wang Wenlong on either side, and they would be dragged through the streets and publicly denounced. Throngs, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. Were they all in support of? It didn't matter. you wanted to be there. You didn't want your neighbors to think that. Every neighbor thought that their neighbor might be. And there's this sort of paranoia, this that develops, that is part of these mass type revolutions also. So definition of a revolution needs to be also very carefully thought out and seen, because for most of the time we see the concept of revolution in a fairly positive way, that it's a change in society for the better of society, but it's maybe not always the case, as we know. So here they are, and young Red Guards go to the movies to watch the propaganda filmed about the chairman. And Li Zhensheng goes to the movie houses and he photographs these people and he photographs the screen and he brings them together. The amount of work he did and the sort of thought that he put in the process is absolutely exceptional. He worked for the newspaper, so he was part of the propaganda machine. He was the head of a rebel team, so he was a revolutionary. All this within the structure. He was not a member of the party. He tried desperately to become a member of the Communist Party. He was always rejected. Early on, when he was at school, and when he was at the newspaper, even more so, because to be a member of the party meant that as a photographer, as a journalist, you could cover all the important events, the official events, where the officials of the state and the province and the party would be attending. He never could do that. Only his four colleagues would, not him. His four colleagues were members of the party. Actually, his wife was also a member of the party. But after the suicide of her mother, she was eliminated and lost her position. But even his wife could not have helped him as a photographer, because you needed that trace that you were. So there are all these demonstrations here. They're burning stock and security certificates to denounce capitalism and imperialism and so on and so forth. This woman was accused of being a property owner, to own some stuff, some stock, some things, and therefore was a thief, and she was denounced. And the same process always in the same stadium, that big stadium that was the People's Stadium became the Red Guards Stadium. It later on would be renamed the People's Stadium, but for almost 10 years, it became Red Guards Stadium. And many of the events in Harbin, that was the rallying point. It was a stadium where at least 100,000 people could sit and participate in things. These young kids are wearing Red Guard armbands and are marching, to defend the chairman and the revolution. And they're only 8, 9, 10 years old.
Yes. ¿Puedes beber un poco de agua?
Could we have some water? Yes.
No sé si podemos concluir ya un poco.
Could we conclude maybe, because it's running a bit late? Perhaps, can we? No, perhaps we can conclude. Perhaps we can conclude, because it's getting a bit late. Do you think we can conclude, because we're running out of time?
Very quickly, you get a general idea, and I'd say a few words along. This is on Tiananmen Square. Mao would meet 8 times the Red Guards. He would meet them. There were 11 million people who went on those 8 occasions on Tiananmen Square, which means that he would appear at the top of the balcony and wave, and he had met them. That's what a meeting was. So Li Zhensheng was sent with 5,000 Red Guards for his newspaper from Harbin to attend actually what was the biggest of these meetings. A bit like, you know, a photographer is sent with the soccer fans of your team to the other city to play the other team. So he goes and documents. Well, that's what he did with 5,000 Red Guards. And of course, Li's dream is to photograph the chairman, to meet him and photograph him. So he had prepared himself and thought he would take a series of pictures. And the chairman appeared on Chang'an Avenue, or one of the avenues leading to the Forbidden City, standing in a Jeep, holding his hands apart as if he was clapping, but not clapping, looking very dignified. And the Jeep just went by, and he was only able, Li Zhensheng, to take one picture. This is, I think it's a fantastic picture. The wind is blowing in the trees, the Jeep is going the other way. It's perfectly composed. It's very dramatic at the same time. And the Red Guards in attendance were very happy, were writing in their diaries that they met at 12:33 and 17 seconds, the chairman, etc. And this is Li Zhensheng in the middle here. Young man, he's a very elegant, nice looking, playboy-like, if you will, somewhat. He wouldn't be happy if I said that, so I take my words away. Young man on Tiananmen Square. And of course, portraits of Mao appear everywhere, public humiliation of the same. Li Fanwu and others go on and on and on and on, but also, all of a sudden, the different rebel groups are fighting between each other and accusing each other of being traitors or counter-revolutionaries, and they bring each other to denounce themselves, and they do the same process all the time. And the kids go and get the latest edition of Mao Zedong's complete works to study at home, these young kids. And the People's Liberation Army destroys all the municipal placards and signs and replace them by revolutionary things. The army is involved. That's Lin Biao and his influence on this. And this is one of the Red Guards. It's a bit too long to explain, but finally his rebel group got the official red collar new soldier armband, which is why I chose that as the cover, for the cover of the book, Red Collar New Soldier. Red collar, revolutionary, foot soldier, that's the photographer. The foot photographer is somebody who walks for the revolution. That's the concept of a journalist, a photographer in China at that time. And Li Zhensheng kept everything. He kept everything, every armband, everything. It's an amazing museum that he has. And he would participate in denouncing some of his colleagues. He had to, he was part of a rebel group, so he had to denounce the others. He apparently was very gentle and very kind, and there was never any brutalities at his sessions, unlike others, but he is there sitting in the middle behind at that table. 2 years later, he would be standing on the other side and been publicly humiliated and then sent for education for 2 years. Here he is denouncing. This picture is his. Sorry? This photography is taken by him. Is what?
This photograph is taken by him.
No. That's one of his colleagues who took the picture. No, that's not a self-portrait. No, thank you. That's a good question. No. And then he attends so many events like this one, which is amazing. And look at the way he photographs this. This is such an important sequence. He's a filmmaker. He's shooting from the top of the building, this scene where the official people are denouncing the Red Guards, if you will, the revolutionary people are sitting behind the table, and there are chairs over there. And then a huge crowd. And then people are brought out from the building. And who is the first person you see? Li Fanwu, that same guy. Part of the 2,000 times he's brought out, followed by Wang Yulun and Chen Lei and the others. And they're forced to stand on the chair on the chairs and are publicly denounced. And so you can see the camera work of Li, how with his still camera, he's working like a cameraman in film making, and all of a sudden he's on the other side. And he takes two pictures, a panoramic image that he will stitch together. And then he will photograph each one of them individually like this to keep a record of everything. That is so amazing. That is so remarkable. And then he attends these clashes between the different rebel groups that are very brutal. This young guy will die. And it's announced in the middle of all this that China has successfully exploded its H-bomb for the first time in 1966 or 67 by now. So all of a sudden there's another context that is there, and that is the intelligence, because Li didn't have to do all these things. He didn't have to. He could have taken the assignments for the newspaper and left it at that. But he goes to the university where the books in the library are used as weapons. A hardcover book thrown like what do you call it, around the plastic thing.
Yes.
Frisbee.
Huh? Frisbee.
Frisbee, that's it. Thank you. They kill people with a book thrown like a Frisbee. You should just try it for the fun, but don't do it. Don't teach your kids to do it. So he's everywhere. Li is everywhere, and he's in the countryside and where the Red Guards are with the peasants and the fishermen participating in all the propaganda thing for the anniversary of the famous swim of Chairman Mao in the Yangtze River at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, when people were saying that his health wasn't good. He wanted to prove otherwise, so he went and swam in the river for 3 hours. Li wasn't there, but there was a year later a reenactment of it, and so on. And Li does his self-portraits, always in the same place, in the same office, his office. That becomes his studio. He does these self-portraits of him during the Cultural Revolution. There are only a few here, but there are many. Kids are used as propaganda tools. The newspaper endlessly thing, the PLA is there doing its propaganda work. Posters and billboards are designed to denounce things. And once again, that technique of using diptychs exists. Li Zhensheng's press card. Now, if you look carefully, there's a space on your left where the stamp, the red stamp is above, there's parentheses, and there's a white space. And that is where is written member of the party. And if it's not there, you don't enter any of the official functions. So it was never stamped on his card. He gets married, and at the newspaper, they organize a wedding ceremony, and they sort of make fun of the whole process. They put placards that say, we wish you a happy life. Of course, they're not denouncing any crimes of any kind, but that gives you a sense of what that period of time was like. I'd go very fast. This is no longer a public humiliation session in the streets. No, it's the taking of 7, 8 people, including one woman. Here you can see her with her lover. They were sentenced to death for having killed her husband. So it's one of these, stories that we would read in newspapers here and magazines. And among the 8 people, there are two people who were considered as very dangerous activists. They wrote a flyer speaking about looking towards the north, and the north meant the Soviet Union that had become a revisionist and a bad country, and therefore they were sentenced to death. And Li manages to get there. He had some connections with the newspaper. He attends the event and he photographs the whole sequence. He was not supposed to photograph the shooting or the after shooting or the scene. So he shot from his hip, like photographers do, very discreetly. A Leica makes no noise. He just shot and got these interesting images, if you will. And
Robert, es que nos van a echar.
We are going to get kicked out if we carry on. Yes, we've got to finish because we're going to get kicked out if we don't. It's very interesting, but we have run out of time. We had never had a 10-year revolution to explain in 60 minutes. It's impossible. But I don't know, we've got 8 minutes left. Maybe there's some question, or the question could be, if you haven't finished and there is something absolutely crucial that you must say, we've got 8 minutes. And if not, perhaps we'll look at some of the questions, online questions.
I'm happy to try and answer to anything. I do realize it takes time. I usually do these kinds of talks in 2 to 2.5 hours. It's not the Fidel Castro syndrome of speaking endlessly. It's just that the materials, the work by this man is so enormous, and the event itself, and because China today is such an important country, it is really meaningful to try and understand what happened there, why this country was shaped in this way, and what went on, and the amazing role that this individual, this singular person played, who was not distant. He wasn't meant to do that. There was nothing in the stars written ready to say that, but he did it, and in a very subtle way. And as I said, he was a victim of the events too. I mean, he was brutalized. He was during the socialist education movement. He spent 2 years when his colleagues only spent 1 year in education. When he was sent to hard labor at the Li Hu 7th of May camps, he was supposed to be re-educated for 1 year. Because he was so undisciplined and independent or whatever, he stayed there for 2 years. He got his dose of punishment, but it also gave him a knowledge and a wisdom that is without comparison.
Y es debido a eso que él.
Is that why he was aware of how dangerous his work was? Because he hid all those negatives under the floorboards. He was aware of how dangerous all this was.
Yes, he knew, because he became politically very savvy. He knew how it worked, and he knew that these images would not be published and should not be shown. And he knew that there was the risk in this environment of absolute madness that they could be destroyed. And he was very concerned about that. And his master, Wu Yingshang, had said, you record for the future. So he had to protect his recording. I don't think he was concerned about his own personal safety and his family's safety, but he understood he had to hide the stuff, and he knew what was not acceptable or not. He had enough and good editorial judgment to make that decision. This is a good example of an image overlapped and becoming a singular image. So he took risks all his life in a very smart way, and he protected the work because he realized that it was so important to do so. Otherwise, at one point after the revolution, even during, but after the revolution, all the photographers who worked in newspapers were asked to turn in their negatives from the events they had covered during the Cultural Revolution. And most of them did. And those negatives were burnt and destroyed. So there are only a few photographers who were in a more privileged position who did keep their work, their propaganda work. But Li Zhensheng seems to be the only one who did what he did and has a complete overview of that revolution, both as a propaganda photographer and as an independent photographer. He's on both sides of the coin, and he's looking from different perspectives with this very special training of his as a filmmaker that makes him look under many angles. That is what is so exceptional with his work. Sorry.
It's a kind of miracle that someone like Li existed in such a time, but it's also a kind of miracle that you two met, and he had someone like you to be here to record all this and tell us in such a short period of time that amount of things. Thank you very much. Where all this stuff he kept, you said he had hundreds of things and he kept all them. Where are them now?
Okay, I'll answer with the last question. Most of it is in his home in Beijing, where he has an apartment, and very much so in New York and Flushing, where he lived. And part of it I have at the Contact Press Images office in New York. All the important things, documents, objects we've got, and most of the negatives. So it's pretty well preserved for the future. We will place it somewhere in a permanent archive at some stage. Yes, it is a great privilege to have met him at that time. I'm not an expert on China, as you know. Africa was my interest, but many of my friends at the School of Oriental and African Studies in Paris, where I studied, were studying Russian and Arabic and Japanese and Hebrew and Chinese. And many of them became experts on China. And some became diplomats, other journalists, and did different things. But in 1968, when I was on the streets of Paris as a rebel, a student, quite a few people I knew were Maoists. And I was really disturbed by that because I'm a social democrat, I'm a liberal, I never was a leftist, and certainly not a Maoist. And I was fascinated to see these children of good families becoming ultra leftist revolutionaries, etc. There's something that totally puzzled me because I didn't think that what was going on in China, but I was an expert, was all that phenomenal. So when I had the opportunity in 1988, a young Chinese photographer who was studying in New York came to see me and said, you know, we've got to take the exhibition you did at the International Center of Photography in New York to China. This is the right time to do it. I said, if you can organize it, I'll do it with you. And we did. I don't get into details, it was complicated, but we did. And I took those three humongous exhibitions I had curated separately, brought them together. One was a World Press Photo museum exhibition I had done on 30 years of human rights issues. The other one was on Contact Press Images work, the first 10 years. And the third one was the history of photography, 150 years. It was an amazing compilation of things. And we showed it at the National Museum of History on Tiananmen Square, 6 months before the events that would take place there. 10,000 people a day. It touched a nerve, it had something. So that encounter, and I was, as an anthropologist and somebody and a journalist, I was fascinated by China, going to a place I had never been to. I knew something about, but not much. And meeting Li, you know, really hit a nerve. And I realized how important his work was without ever seeing a picture, just by the way he spoke about it. Now, when he came to see me in New York, he wanted me to do a book about his best photography. He brought me 300 images or 200 images maybe, and said, can you do a book with my best 150 pictures? And I said, no, I don't do that. as I explained earlier, I want to see everything. And I'm not interested about your best pictures. I'm interested in about your most important, significant, meaningful images. And when I start digging into this and I saw what was there, I said, this is about history. This is about photography and history. This is about history of photography and looking at history through still images with the eye of a film person and a human being who had lived so many different experiences, from being sort of an orphan at a young stage, being moved around different provinces, being a rebel, very independent. He also collected stamps, and he sold his stamp collection to buy his first camera, which was a cheap Chinese camera. And later on, when he was a student, he did something amazing. He had assignments to do portraiture, and he used himself as his main subject, as I told you. And he would cut out these images from his contact sheets, and he put them in a book, an accordion book, a book that is sort of an accordion with both sides. On one side were all the horizontal frames, on the other side, all the vertical frames and the portraits. And it looked like a stamp collection. And you realize how all these different elements of his life are part of a bigger puzzle, that the book itself was a story of his life, but it was a story about part of the revolution, and it was a story about filmmaking and about photography and about everything else. That's what I was so fascinated. I've met many photographers and I worked with many, and I still do. And he is one of the most extraordinary people I met because of the complexity and the multiple facets of this character. And for somebody who was an anthropologist, that is so important. It's all these little details that you put together that allow you to see the bigger picture. But that's what photography is about. All these little single images, if they're edited and shaped and brought together, like notes of music on a score, they can have a symphonic resonance. And I think that's what Li Zhensheng did so masterfully.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Here in China, you applaud back, and Li Zhensheng would have said, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. So since I was speaking for him, I do thank you very much. Those who are here in this room and those who are around the world, if they are listening to this speech, and to Laura for having conducted and disciplined me at the right time.
Es muy difícil. La verdad es que cortar a mí es lo que más me cuesta.
It's very difficult to stop things. It's very difficult to have to stop things, but I have to do it because we are running out of time. I would not, but thank you very, very much.
¿Alguna pregunta tenéis? ¿Alguna cosa que os haya quedado ahí? Concedemos un minuto.
No.
Tenemos una pregunta online que podemos hacerla.
We've got a question online. We can ask the question. The question is whether maybe if you had met Cartier-Bresson when he was in China taking pictures of the revolution.
Well, Cartier-Bresson was a very good friend, and I did meet him many, many times, and I did see all his pictures on China because I was doing a book on Tiananmen Square after 1989, and I knew he had been there, and I asked him one day if I could look at his pictures, and he said, well, sure, but I don't have many prints. I said, well, can I look at the contact sheets? He said, of course, I trust you. And he sent me over to Magnum. They were very surprised, and I saw all, which not many people have on China. And actually, can we move this very fast? I want to show you one last picture then. And I met Cartier-Bresson, and if I had met him then, and if he had asked me to work with him, I would have, because Cartier-Bresson is an extraordinary man also. I liked him a lot, and each time I wanted some advice or some help, he always gave it to me. And particularly when Li Zhensheng, see, this is the press card 10 years later. There's a space under the stamp or near the stamp open that doesn't have anything in there. But Li Zhensheng wanted to meet Cartier-Bresson. That was his goal in life. There was Wu Yingxiang in China and Cartier-Bresson, because he's the only or first fine photographer he had heard about. So I called Cartier-Bresson and said, oh, he wants to meet you. And Cartier-Bresson in those days, he was already 97, 7, said to me, you know, I don't want to meet anybody anymore. I'm not in photography anymore. I said, but he's a Chinese photographer. I said, that's different. I said, yes. And I explained to him how Li Zhensheng had come to learn about Cartier-Bresson through Wu Yingxiang, who knew of Cartier-Bresson, and that was one of his guiding forces. And he said, yes, we'll meet only for 15 minutes. So we got together in our lecture, and 3 hours later, we left each other, and of course they had become the best of friends, etc. And that for Li Zhensheng was one of the biggest rewards he ever got. So yeah, I would have worked with Cartier-Bresson very gladly. I saw an exhibition in New York that of Cartier-Bresson's work I had never seen before, when Cartier-Bresson was in India at the time of the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. And he was there and he photographed the events around and the funeral. And it is an amazing body of work. I mean, that's when you realize that Cartier-Bresson was really a photojournalist in the best and most noble sense, a way of telling a story, a bit like Li had been moving around in a very elegant way and taking pictures and telling a story, not just decisive moments. There were no decisive moments, there were extraordinary moments. And I understand the affinity that they both had. There's a quality and a vision and an understanding of the world and humanity that is quite the same.
Pues ha sido una intuición la de nuestro colega Mark.
Well, that was a very good idea to ask that question. That was a very good idea to ask that final question about Cartier-Bresson and Li Zhensheng. And we're going to say goodbye now and see you next week. Next week we have another lecture. It is devoted to Black Power. Black Power. Lake Rafford is the speaker. It will be online, not in person, because she cannot come to Barcelona like you have. And it's been wonderful to have you here. And it's worthwhile to have shared this room with you. Thank you very much.
Because for Li Zhensheng, Barcelona was one of the important. His first exhibition was in Paris at the Hôtel de Sully, which is, and when I told him that his exhibition would be at the Hôtel de Sully, he went online and he checked and he found online Hôtel de Sully, a 2-star hotel on the Rue de Rivoli, and he called me up one day and said, am I having my exhibition in this hotel? I was stunned, and I said, no, the Hôtel de Sully is a very prestigious building of the 16th century, where the Duke of Sully, Sully, who was the prime minister or the minister of finance of King Louis XIII, and he had his house there, and it is a museum. It's not that 2-star hotel around the corner. He was reassured.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Muchas gracias.